Hello, everyone. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our next speaker, who is also the session organizer. So Dr. Rebecca Nelson, I wanted to start out by saying a couple years ago, Northern California botanists decided to change our bylaws so that we could include one or more student board members. Some of you may have remembered, I think all NCB members voted on that change to our bylaws. And so a couple years ago, we made that change, and then we advertised for student board members. And we were so lucky to have Rebecca Nelson apply and become our first ever student board member. So we should give her a round of applause for that to begin with. She's done so much. And then, as I just said, I said Dr. Rebecca Nelson because she actually just finished her PhD. Woo-hoo! She actually had her defense seminar last Friday, less than a week ago, and is here presenting today. So in any case, I wanted to just share a little bit about her background information. So Dr. Nelson very recently completed her PhD in ecology at UC Davis and has just begun a postdoctoral research position at Utah State University with Peter Adler.
Oh, Peter.
Yeah, he's great. He's great. I'm so glad that Rebecca will be working with him. Her research explores how human impacts to the environment affect plant-pollinator mutualisms. And her talk today is entitled Cross-Ecosystem Effects of Plant Invasions on Serpentine Plant-Pollinator Networks. So thank you, Rebecca, and welcome.
Thank you.
Dr. Nelson.
Thank you so much for that really kind introduction, Carrie. It's an honor to be speaking with you all today. Before I dive into the specifics of my research, I'd like to first make some brief acknowledgments, particularly to my advisors and collaborators on this research, Dr. Susan Harrison, Dr. Fernanda Valdivinos, and Dr. Neil Williams, whose support was really essential throughout my grad school journey. I'd further like to acknowledge the land in which this study took place, as well as additional technicians and collaborators who supported this work, particularly Paul Agner and Kathy Kohler at the University of California McLaughlin Reserve, who provided really important information on field sites. And I'd further like to acknowledge the many funders who have supported this research. Thank you. So I want to take you all today to serpentine grasslands. And serpentine grasslands have these really unique serpentine soils that are lacking in a lot of the basic nutrients that plants need to survive. And they also have these really high concentrations of heavy metals that can be toxic to many plant species. So because of that, similar to what Alexia was describing, they act as an environmental filter, preventing most exotic weeds from establishing in serpentine grasslands that have otherwise invaded a lot of California's ecosystems. Thus, serpentine grasslands are what are known as refugia for a lot of California's high native plant biodiversity, providing these refuges for native plants that are mostly free from the effects of exotic species. Serpentine grasslands disproportionately support both plant diversity as well as pollinator diversity within California and are often a focus for conservation efforts. However, even though we think of them as these refugia spatially, serpentine grasslands are still vulnerable to many of the impacts that we have as people on the environment. In fact, they often occur in really patchy mosaics with other plant communities nearby them. So what we have in this photo is a picture of a boundary between a serpentine grassland and a non-serpentine grassland that I took at the UC McLaughlin Reserve up near Clear Lake, California in the Coast Range. And if you look at the background of the photo, the serpentine grassland is supporting a really diverse community of native wildflowers, whereas the foreground of the photo has an invaded non-serpentine grassland that just has regular sandstone-derived soils. And this non-serpentine grassland has mostly invasive species, including some invasive wildflowers. And because pollinators are these really highly mobile foragers that move across the landscape, they have the potential to be moving between serpentine and non-serpentine grasslands and visiting plant species in both habitat types. So this got me wondering whether these serpentine plants can be impacted by non-serpentine plants through the movement of shared pollinators across these ecological boundaries. So my work that I'll be sharing today explores the question of, do invasive plants in neighboring non-serpentine ecosystems have pollinator-mediated effects on the pollination and fitness of serpentine wildflowers? And to approach this question, I decided to focus on a few focal plant species. So in the spring, we have 2 legumes that co-flower and share pollinators, including both the bumblebees that Dylan talked about today, as well as osmia bees, similar to the ones that Alexia presented on just before me. On the top, we have bull clover, or Trifolium fucatum, which is a native wildflower that grows primarily on serpentine soils. And then on the bottom, the purple one is hairy vetch, or Vicia villosa, which is a non-native wildflower that grows only on non-serpentine soils. And you may remember from Dylan's talk that Vicia was known to be a major source for pollinators within the Bumblebee Atlas data as well. So these 2 species grow on different soil types, so they don't compete for shared soil nutrients, but they do co-flower and share pollinators with each other. Similarly, in the summer, we can look at some asters. In the serpentine, we have the serpentine sunflower, which is an endemic native aster that grows mostly on serpentine seeps, and it co-flowers with the very functionally similar plant, the yellow star thistle, or Centaurea solistalis, which grows on non-serpentine soils. And yellow star thistle is a particularly pernicious invader that has been a very economically costly invasive plant species to a lot of California's rangelands. And again, these 2 plant species co-flower and share pollinators with each other. So to test this question of whether pollinators are visiting both of these plant species in ways that can affect their pollination, I conducted an observational study at the UC McLaughlin Reserve, where I found a series of meadows that had these plant species and also contained an ecological boundary between a serpentine and a non-serpentine grassland. And then I surveyed each of the meadows with my team of field technicians for pollinator visitation to the focal plant species, as well as I collected seed set as an indicator of serpentine plant fitness, because these are annual plant species. And then I further surveyed the entire interacting web of plant-pollinator interactions to look at the functional role that each of these species play within the overall plant-pollinator network. And I'm going to share a little bit about what I've found. So we'll start with looking at pollinator visitation to our serpentine wildflowers. And throughout these results, I'm going to be showing invasive to native plant ratio on the x-axis. And what this variable is a measure of the relative abundance of how many invasive wildflowers are in the non-serpentine side of the boundary to how many serpentine wildflowers are on the serpentine side of the boundary. So it's capturing differences in the landscape level abundance of these different plant species. And then on the y-axis here, we have pollinator richness. So we find a significant negative relationship between invasive to native plant ratio and pollinator richness. So what this means is that as we get relatively more invasive wildflowers at our boundary, we find that the richness of pollinators on our serpentine wildflowers decreases. So let's see what happens now when we look at also abundance of pollinators. So we find something similar. We again find that there's a significant negative relationship between invasive to native plant ratio as well as the abundance of pollinators visiting the serpentine wildflowers for both species. So what this means is that, again, as we get relatively more invasive non-serpentine wildflowers to serpentine native wildflowers at these ecosystem boundaries, we find that not only do the serpentine plants have a less diverse community of pollinators visiting them, but they also receive fewer total pollinator visits overall. So as a next step, I began to wonder, we see some changes in visitation, but could this have any meaningful bearing on the fitness of these serpentine wildflowers? So I also looked at seed set, and I'm going to show you some results here for both of our focal native species. So for seed set, I measured the mean seed mass of the clovers because they tend to be heavier, fewer seeds. And for the sunflowers, which produce a lot of little tiny seeds, I decided to count the overall total number of seeds in the sunflower seed head. And what we find here is, again, a negative relationship between seed set of our native serpentine plants and the ratio of invasive to native plant at the boundary. But this relationship is only statistically significant for the bull clover in the spring, not for the sunflower in the summer. So what this means is that as we increase the ratio of invasive to native plant and the area around the boundary gets relatively more invaded, what we find is that we also see associated decreases in the seed set of our serpentine plants. And I think that the changes that we see in the visitation that I showed you earlier are a really likely mechanism for what is driving this pattern. I also looked at the quality of the visits by counting how much of the invasive plant pollen ends up on the stigmas of the serpentine native plants. And what we found was that there's very little of the wrong kind of pollen that gets on the serpentine stigmas. It only happened about 9.7% of the time. So it's likely that this potential seed set pattern is driven by, instead, some of the changes we see in visitation. So then finally, I wanted to zoom out more broadly and look at what happens with these changes in plant abundance at the boundary with the overall functional role that these different species play within the plant pollinator network. So here are some network diagrams. And if you're unfamiliar with networks, each of those boxes on the top row represents a unique species of pollinator in our data, and each of the boxes on the bottom row represents a unique plant species. So we have the invasive vetch highlighted in purple and our serpentine bull clover highlighted in beige. And the lines between them represent plant-pollinator interactions. And the thicker a particular box or line is in the data, the more frequently we observe that particular species or interaction. So these are all networks, and each network represents a unique combination of meadow and year. And these are all ones where they had a very low ratio of invasive plant to native plant. Let's see what happens as we increase the amount of vetch at the boundary relative to clover. So what we find is that the overall shape of the network is similar, but the clover, which starts out as this really functional hub for pollinators within the network, gets replaced by the invasive vetch, instead acting as a really important hub for pollinators. And then we can see, again, for the summer this time, what happens. So now we have a very similar set of networks, but this time these are for sunflowers, which are in orange, and then our invasive star thistle is in yellow. And for sites where we have very low amounts of thistle relative to serpentine sunflower, we find that the sunflower is acting as this really important hub for pollinators within the network. But then as we increase the amount of thistle relative to sunflower at the boundary, again, we find the same pattern where the thistle starts to replace the sunflower as this big hub within the network. And we can use network math to quantify this relationship. And what we find is that as we increase the ratio of invasive to native plant at the boundary, that there's a positive relationship with the role that the invasive plant plays within the network. So in other words, as we get relatively more invasive flowers on the non-serpentine part of the boundary to serpentine flowers, our invasive serpentine plants more strongly influence the overall structure of the network by attracting both generalist and specialist pollinators. And this relationship, though, is only statistically significant in the summer with our star thistle effects on the network. So some key takeaways from this talk are that pollinator spillover is tracking changes in plant abundance within these patchy landscapes. When the ratio of invasive to native plant is really high, what we find is that pollinators may be foraging more on the invasive species in the non-serpentine, leading the serpentine plants to have fewer pollinator visits, lower seed set, and a more limited role within the plant pollinator network. And then when we have a low ratio of invasive to native species at the boundary, we find that the opposite happens, and instead, pollinators tend to forage on the more relatively abundant serpentine plants, leading the serpentine plants to have more pollinator visits, higher seed set, and an important functional role as hubs within the network. So if you take away anything from this talk, it's that serpentine grasslands are refugia, but they're refugia within a very patchy mosaic. So it's important to consider the role of patchiness in affecting serpentine pollination and plant fitness. So some final implications that I'd like to share for management of these landscapes is that when conserving these serpentine grasslands as diversity hotspots, it's important to further consider the quality and the plant composition of the surrounding non-serpentine grasslands, perhaps further moving to restore those non-serpentine ecosystems as well. Thank you so much. It's been a real honor to give a talk today, and I'd love to take questions at this time. And also, please come talk to me or shoot me an email if you want to chat about pollinators or restoration or grasslands. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll share a crotchy photo as well. Thank you. All right, I see a question over by the CNGA booth.
Hello, Dr. Nelson. It's good to see you.
You too.
So, as a restoration manager, you always have trade-offs, right? And you're trying to decide, okay, which of these areas should I focus on? Is one of the implications you could take from your research that smaller patches of serpentine are more vulnerable because they have more edge effects than larger patches?
That's a great question, Julia. Thank you. Yeah, that is indeed, I think, a good takeaway, because often with the smaller serpentine patches, there's relatively more invasive plants in the non-serpentine surrounding them that can potentially affect their pollination, whereas if you have a larger serpentine patch, it might be more robust to some of those cross-boundary invasion effects. Thank you. There's a question from Lynn.
Hello, Dr. Nelson. That was wonderful. Those network graphs are amazing. I'm wondering about your sampling methods, if you can talk more about that. Did you do quadrants on the edge and sample abundance? And how did you collect your specimens?
Those are fantastic questions. So we did both timed observations on the focal plant species, but we also did transect surveys where we divided the meadow into evenly spaced transects to cover both of the different soil types. And then we surveyed all of the floral visitors that came in contact with the reproductive parts of the plant, identifying them to morphospecies, and then using both photographs, particularly for sensitive species, as well as netting voucher specimens, which were then identified with support from the Bohart Museum of Entomology, to then confirm what species we had in the data. Thank you.
I have a question. I'm right here. So that was a great talk, so interesting. And I wonder if you would consider extrapolating, or perhaps too dangerous, thinking beyond just the serpentine environments and their cross relationship with the adjacent non-native lands to vernal pools, to meadows adjacent to uplands. Does this same sort of thing of draining the pollination richness happen across boundaries, do you think, in these other ecosystem pairs?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Thank you. I think indeed it does. Like, for instance, with boundaries between wildlands and agricultural systems, there's been a lot of evidence of pollinator spillover, particularly in research on hedgerows as ways to bring wild pollinators into agroecosystems, but also with vernal pools, I think it's a possibility as well. But one thing to consider there is the water aspect, because sometimes the upland habitats that are near the vernal pools have a very different flowering phenology than that of the vernal pools. So I think for vernal pools too, I think also there's a phenological dimension too that might influence the degree to which the pollinators are spilling over. And I think there's been work by Robin Thorpe showing that like there's nesting crossover between like pollinators nesting in uplands and then using vernal pools. Thank you. Yeah, and it looks like we have time for one last question. Cool. If no more questions, thank you so much.